Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Minerva, for being here and agreeing to give this talk. Some background about Minerva. She did her bachelor's at University of Illinois and worked with Bob McLeese, if you all know, the state soil scientist at that time, and she was introduced to the soil science by then, and apparently she fell in love with it. And here she is. Then she went on to do her master's at Purdue University, when she currently is working as a research soil scientist. Her work was focused on the topic of the talk today, and also she has been involved with the IC project too. She was there from the start and has been one of the people that has been heavily involved with making that happen. Currently, she is working at Purdue as a research soil scientist and a coordinator of the Central America project, working with CRS, Catholic Relief Services, and also Purdue on providing them with support for generating their first detailed soil maps using digital mapping and traditional techniques. And she's currently pursuing a PhD. She's going to start this semester at Purdue University, but she's going to be more into the environmental science and with a focus on the tropical soils. And so, without further ado, please, Minerva.
Thank you, Zamir. Hi, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to give this talk today. This was, like Zamir mentioned, a very big part of my master's thesis, and there are a lot of you in here that helped me with achieving the results, and so thank you to you all, and thank you for those of you joining us through the website or through the internet today. And so the title of my talk is a semi-automated model to assess positional accuracy of soil survey Pedon.
Is that not working, Minerva?
Pedon point data for Indiana. Yeah. And so, as we all know, soil Pedon data is very important because it's used in predictive models for developing continuous property maps, for example, or for land management, for infrastructure. And this data, if it's used in these types of models, can help for a variety of things and at many different scales, from regional to the field scale or smaller. And so it's important to understand the limitations of this Pedon data. Here's a slide on the current status of soil Pedon data. These are all the Pedon points available across the world from the NCSS database. And as you can see, most of them are centered in, or mostly dense in the United States. And this is from over 100 years of surveys of point collections and field surveys. And so the NCSS states on their website that this database has not been edited to remove all of the erroneous or sometimes misleading data, and that it's up to the user to then assess the accuracy and applicability of the data. However, we feel in the research field, at least in our department, that many people oversee this information, and they assume that because this data has been published by the government, that it's been validated, and so it is accurate as is. And so we know, however, then, that due to database migrations, limited quality control, and inherent error associated with soil surveying, that this data can be incomplete, not in a usable format, erroneous. And so these are all issues that we hope to address. We wanted to assign a sort of positional accuracy or a measure of accuracy to these points so that we could present that to the users. So the objectives of the study were to develop a methodology to improve the positional accuracy of Pedon point data that was collected before GPS was used widely in the field. And so after speaking with many of the soil scientists in NRCS, they suggested this would be prior to 1995, and to focus on points before 1995 for those collected without GPS. Two, our second objective was to place Pedon points in a geographic location in an environment and soil forming factors that were originally described. And I'll get into the definition of the soil environment in a little bit. And then three, we wanted to assign a measure of positional accuracy to these Pedon points. our hypotheses were that legacy data and expert knowledge are necessary tools to improve the positional accuracy of Pedon points. Pedon points can be moved to a more accurate location by matching their soil environment to their description to information stored in survey databases. Survey databases, in this case, we use Surgo, the database. And 3, ArcGIS tools, or GIS tools in general, can be developed to assign a clear measure of positional accuracy. Okay, so most of you are probably familiar with these forms. This is an example of soil profile description form that would have been completed. In this case, this is from a description done conducted in 1973. And so the top part of the profile description form would include the series at that time, the series name at that time, erosion class, landform, parent material. It was assigned a soil number in this database. But most importantly, it was given a location description that referenced the PLSS, or the Public Land Survey System. This is an example of the Pedon data for Indiana. These were first collected in 1967 in Indiana, and they were part of a cooperative effort between the U.S. Soil Survey and Purdue University. And they followed strict guidelines outlined in the Soil Survey Manual. And I'm sorry for the format here. I think it changed the format when it converted to PDF. And so, like I already mentioned, these site descriptions included landscape details, describers information, dates, and most importantly, these location descriptions. Okay, so U.S. Soil Survey Pedon data for Indiana was migrated into NRCS in 2007. And we know that prior to 1995, mostly, the source used to georeference this Pedon data was the 5-point system that referenced the PLSS. After 1995, we're assuming that GPS units were used. And so this is a little bit of background on the U.S. Public Land Survey System, the PLSS. It is a tier system of grids of decreasing land area. You probably all remember these from soil survey training. And so it's composed of these standard lines, the principal meridians that run north and south, and the baselines that run east and west. And those divide up or section off the state into townships and ranges. And each township, which you see here in yellow at the top, and this block, this white block, consists of 36 sections, approximately. And within those, there are quarter sections, quarter sections, and quarter sections of decreasing area. However, this isn't an equal area division. The PLSS is quite imperfect. We know that northwest corners of the townships tend to be very irregular because these were the last sections to be surveyed. So you can see in this example here that this section, which would probably be section 1 and 6, would be quite irregular. And so these would have an excess or deficiency in the area. And this was sometimes due to the convergence and divergence of the meridians. There were correction lines installed where you can see some strange breaks across the state. That's where correction lines were installed for the principal meridian. And so we also know that portions of Indiana were surveyed using a different system. But for this study, we really focused on the PLSS because it was the most extensive. And it's also used across 30 states. And so, like I mentioned earlier, the location descriptions in those field profile description sheets from the soil survey would reference the 5-point system for location, which was a location described as a distance and cardinal direction from the corner or center of a section of the PLSS. And so soil scientists would record their location on a photo or a topo map, return to the office, and then they would, using a scale and a ruler, they would determine where on the PLSS that point had been sampled using this 5-point system. In this example here, we're looking at, if we want to describe the position of point B, we would say that it is the southeast quarter of the southeast quarter of the southwest quarter of section 10 of township TN North, range 3 of the second principal meridian in this case. Okay, and so we had to, if we were going to delve into this and understand about the error associated in the location of these Pedon points, we need to understand how the NRCS had derived a coordinate point location for points that were sampled before GPS. And so I spoke with Thomas Reinsch, who had developed a PLSS conversion model. And I spoke to him over the phone a couple of times and asked him to describe his model to me, told him about this study, and he gave me a description of how the conversion model worked, which essentially what it did is it converted this textual location description, the location details on those profile description forms, to a coordinate point in NAD 83 datum, and assigned these as official, these were listed then as the official Pedon locations in NACIS. But there were several issues with this PLSS conversion model. And the first was that the accuracy of the model really depended on these equal area polygon sections. Because back then, the best available digitized PLSS grid was the only thing he could use for this model, and that was only as detailed as a section. So there was no digitized quarter section, quarter section, or quarter section. So his model also assumed that the corners of these sections were a half-mile north or south, and also half-mile east or west of the section centroids, which were automatically generated in a GIS program back then. Therefore, his model did not describe locations, or was not able to describe locations beyond the section if these were provided, such as quarter section, feet from a quarter, or beyond. And also, his computer code was written in Visual Basic, and it was a little difficult to follow. So we knew that, understanding these problems with the locations of the Pedon points, we had our first idea for the approach to this study was to create maybe a more detailed PLSS grid and digitize that if possible. But first, we acquired a statewide set of Pedon points. So with the help of Henry Ferguson and Mike Wigington, we extracted 4,141 Pedons and their location details from NACIS for Indiana. And then this data was exported from many tables. We use a unique identifier, and then these are the data columns that we used, that we extracted. We also found that a lot of this data was missing information, especially in the location descriptions, because that's the first section that we looked at. And so we populated this whenever possible. When we plotted these points, the NACIS points for Indiana, we found that 4 were outright, or completely out of the state. There were several others that were along the boundaries of the state, but these 4 stuck out pretty easily. Some were placed in Greenland, Atlantic Ocean, Missouri, and Ohio. And I have a list of those too. And so in order to populate this missing data, especially the missing principal meridian in many of these location descriptions, we used an automated model in ArcGIS because we knew that, for example, the original PLSS conversion model, or Thomas Reinsch's conversion model, did not take into account the principal meridians, and so sometimes we had the same Pedon that had been repeated across the state in the first principal meridian and the second principal meridian, because the same township and range can exist in those two. There are also missing or erroneous directionality in the townships and ranges. For example, sometimes the township range was written as, they were flipped. So it was T2 west, R3N, when it should have been TN north, range 3 west. Okay, and then also, if the PLSS details did not contain the 5-point reference, we assumed that the point was sampled in the center of the smallest parcel. So if they did not provide a distance to the center or a quarter section, we assumed that it was placed in the center, or we placed it in the center. Okay, so then we thought to create a more detailed PLSS grid, and we did some research. We pulled up records of how the PLS had been surveyed in Indiana. And this is a book or a set of documents called A History of the Rectangular Soil System by Albert White. And I read all of the sections involving Indiana. We essentially traced the surveyor's steps on a computer. In his History of the Rectangular Survey System, he includes 1850 general instructions to his deputies by the Surveyor General of the United States for the states of Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan, which provided the meticulous details of how Indiana was surveyed into the PLSS. From that, I created a mathematical model to then recreate the grid in ArcGIS. And so we found that there were 4 different sections, and different by their mathematical dimensions, the borders, which are colored differently here in the township example: pink, green, yellow, and blue. And so we defined the corners of the quarter sections mathematically and placed those into a computer model in Python, ran it in ArcGIS, and developed this new PLSS grid, or more detailed digitized PLSS grid, which looks like this. And so this, we're calling it new PLSS grid, contained full PLSS component information for every section and every subsection in its attribute table, like so, for this section 36. And then we had to validate it. So we looked at, so created a new section grid, quarter, or quarter section, quarter, and quarter section grid. Okay, and in order to validate this one, we used the topo maps, the USGS topo maps, and the Department of Natural Resources PLSS grids. And so we overlaid our PLSS grid over the topo maps, and we noticed that it followed the reference lines pretty well, and it's on the aerial photos as well. But when we compared it to the DNR's PLSS grid, which is an equal area PLSS grid, we noticed that it was very different, which we expected because they simply did an equal area split, whereas we used a math model to portray these boundaries better. Okay, and so now that we had this new PLSS digitized grid, we were able to bring the location descriptions from the profile description forms, parse those, and create another model that would automatically pinpoint a location for each of these in ArcGIS. And this is kind of the model that it follows to place the Pedon point in a location based on the new PLSS grid. Okay, so now we had a way to do relative accuracy. We had the relative positional accuracy of the NASA's Pedon points. So the NASA's Pedon points compared to those point locations compared to the PLSS model Pedon points, which are the points where we use our PLSS model. And we found that 50% of the points fell within 100 meters of each other. So this 11% and 41%. And you see here on the map on the right, circles that are larger mean a greater distance, relative distance. Okay, so this relative positional accuracy wasn't really enough. It didn't really tell us if these points were actually in a location where they had originally been sampled, only whether or not they were close to the NASA's official locations. And so next we created this matching soil environment model. Okay, and this was a measure of accuracy of the point locations in relation to the original soil described at the sampling site from the site descriptions. We define the soil environment as these descriptors as drainage class, parent material, taxonomic classification, order, suborder, up to family particle size. And we took this information from Surgo. So now we had Surgo as our reference for the soil environment data. So for every point for every official NRCS location for the Pedon, we extracted the SURGO data for up to 3 major components. So we extracted the soil environment data from SURGO for up to 3 major components. And these were our results, which tell us that overall, the NRCS Pedon points had this is agreement to each of those parts of the soil environment. Overall, they had a much higher agreement than our PLSS Pedon point locations, which told us then that there was information we were missing, that at some point maybe there were updates made to this database, to the locations of these Pedons that we were not aware of, that maybe they were manually edited, for example. And so we wanted to continue to see if for those points that did not match, at what distance the NRCS points would match the SURGO and soil environment. So we created another model called the Nautilus Match Model, which applied that same soil environment match model to each pixel in a 21 by 21 cell neighborhood. And we could only look at a distance of 140 meters radius because our computing power was just not strong enough to look at any distance beyond this. It took us, I think, a month or about 3 weeks just to run the Nautilus match model at 140 meter radius. But we're actually running it again. And so this match model assigned a new X and Y coordinate at each pixel of a matching soil environment. It found where the soil description matched the soil environment from SURGO, and it placed that Pedon point at that new location. And these are our results. And so for points that had an exact match to the soil environment, so the NRCS point locations that had an exact match, we decided were 0 meters positional accuracy. They were right where they were supposed to be. And we had 1,308 of those Pedon points out of the 4,100. There were 283 that were still not matching at 140 meters, so we had to continue running the model for these. So these were our results for the study. We realized there are several limitations. There are deficiencies in the input Pedon data. We don't know when updates were conducted. We don't know if there were manual updates or if there were updates to the soil description information, the field site information, or the location description. And then also, the SURGO components of the soil environment are just generalizations of the soil. And so this was really, we felt like the best reference that we could use, because we figured soil scientists would only collect a sample and do a full description if they felt that soil existed within that map unit. And then we also were limited by the computer processing power to run this Nautilus match model. And so for that reason, we couldn't go beyond that 140 meter radius. So our conclusions were that we did develop these 3 models to assess positional accuracy of Pedon points: the PLSS model, which gives us a new digitized, more detailed PLSS grid for Indiana, soil environment match model, and the Nautilus match model, which we feel are multi-purpose models that did not exist in ArcGIS before, or in any other GIS that I know of. And really, these are models that we could apply nationwide, or at least in areas where the PLSS has been adopted in those 30 states. And then really the only way of truly knowing where the point was sampled is to having those original field sheets with the pinpricks of the Pedon point locations, and also validating at that site, but even the validation may not work. So we really felt that the best estimate of the soil Pedon location was the soil environment. And we hope that this will help to inform soil scientists of errors in the database, or errors in, or make them aware of at least the imperfections in PLSS grid, if they were not already. And hopefully this can be used also as a model to help guide countries that are just now developing a soil database. And so it's really important for them to, as they're building this, to make sure they have a record of changes that were made and updates to the data. This is actually something that I'm implementing right now in our database for Central America. And so I'd like to thank everyone here again for attending my talk and everyone online. And thank you to my advisors, Philip Owens, Daryl Schultz, and Zamir Libahova, who have been a great help. And then everyone in the NRCS who's helped me so much too, Mike Wigington, Henry Ferguson, Thomas French, Gary Strubin, and Rick Nielsen. So thank you.
All right, well, join me in thanking our presenters. And that concludes our presentation. Thanks, everybody.